I got a call from my hangar's security camera app at 6 in the morning, 7 months ago, showing two bulldozers tearing through my private grass airstrip, while a third machine drove directly through the open hangar door and crushed my crop duster flat against the back wall. And by the time I made it out there myself, the HOA president responsible for ordering it was standing in the wreckage looking, for reasons I genuinely didn't understand yet, almost proud of herself. My name is Duncan Ashwell. I'm 53 years old, and I've run an aerial agricultural application business out of a 900-foot grass airstrip on my own 240 acres for going on 22 years. A strip my father originally built back in 1968 with the help of a federal grant program designed to support agricultural aviation infrastructure in rural counties that lacked reliable crop dusting access, a program that came with conditions attached to that funding. Conditions neither I nor, as it turned out, anyone connected to what happened next fully appreciated the weight of until federal investigators started showing up asking very specific questions. A gated community called Aspen Meadow went up on land bordering my property about 9 years ago, close enough that low-altitude agricultural flight patterns, the kind any crop duster operation requires to actually do the job it exists to do, occasionally passed near enough to the development's edge to be visible and audible from certain homes. I'd flown that exact pattern for over 2 decades before Aspen Meadow ever existed, following FAA regulations and altitude restrictions the entire time. But that history didn't stop the community's HOA president, a woman named Bonnie Kestrel, from deciding almost immediately after her election 2 years ago that my airstrip represented, in her words at a community meeting I only heard about secondhand, an ongoing safety and noise hazard the board had a responsibility to eliminate. I want to be fair and say I tried repeatedly to address her concerns directly, the same way I've tried with nearly every disagreement I've ever had with a neighbor over more than 2 decades running this operation. I adjusted my flight patterns wherever the actual agronomic requirements of the fields I served allowed for it. I met with Bonnie twice, walked her through my FAA operating certificate, the specific altitude regulations governing agricultural aviation, and the 22-year safety record my operation had maintained without a single incident. None of it seemed to move her position even slightly, because I don't believe, looking back, that Bonnie Kestrel was ever actually interested in a workable compromise. She wanted the airstrip gone entirely, and she'd apparently decided, at some point I still don't fully understand, that the fastest way to accomplish that was to simply have it destroyed rather than pursue any of the actual regulatory channels that exist for challenging agricultural aviation operations. Those channels, for what it's worth, do exist, and they're not exactly hidden. Noise and safety complaints about agricultural aviation operations go through the FAA and, depending on the specifics, sometimes state agricultural aviation boards, formal processes that take time but that exist precisely so neighbors with legitimate concerns have a real avenue to raise them. Bonnie never once, in the 2 years leading up to that morning, filed a single formal complaint through any of those channels. What she did instead, I learned only much later, was quietly work with a contractor and apparently at least 2 other board members to arrange for a demolition crew to come out to what she'd apparently convinced herself, or convinced the board, was simply an unregulated dirt strip on private land that the HOA had every right to treat as a straightforward nuisance abatement issue. I was out of state for 4 days at an agricultural aviation safety conference when it happened, a trip I'd taken every year for over a decade, leaving my operation, as I always did, without anyone physically present on site since the strip itself required no daily staffing between flight seasons. I got the security alert at 6 in the morning on what should have been an unremarkable Wednesday, watched footage in real time of 2 bulldozers tearing grooves through a runway surface that had supported safe agricultural takeoffs and landings for over 5 decades, and watched, with a feeling I genuinely don't have adequate words for, a third piece of heavy equipment drive directly into my open hangar and crush my single-engine agricultural aircraft. A plane worth just under $300,000 flat against the hangar's back wall. I drove back from that conference in just under 6 hours, breaking speed limits I don't typically break, and arrived to find exactly what the security footage had shown me: my runway torn apart in long, deliberate gouges, my hangar partially collapsed, and my aircraft, the plane my entire livelihood depended on for the upcoming spraying season that was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks, reduced to a crumpled, unsalvageable wreck. Bonnie Kestrel was still on site when I arrived, along with a contractor and a couple of Aspen Meadow board members I recognized from the one community meeting I'd attended, and I want to describe her reaction honestly because it stayed with me clearly ever since. She didn't appear alarmed or apologetic or even particularly concerned that she was standing in the middle of what was, by any reasonable definition, several $100,000 of destroyed private property. She told me, almost matter-of-factly, that the board had determined the airstrip constituted an unpermitted structure creating an ongoing nuisance, that they'd consulted with a contractor who assured them the demolition was straightforward given that it was, in her words, just a dirt field, and that she considered the matter resolved. I called the county sheriff's department immediately, and a deputy named Renner arrived within 20 minutes, walked the scene, documented the destruction with his own photographs, and informed Bonnie Kestrel on the spot that she was facing potential criminal charges for destruction of private property, a conversation she apparently did not take especially seriously. Based on what Deputy Renner told me afterward about her continued insistence that the HOA board had acted within its rights to address a community safety hazard. What none of us fully understood yet, standing in that wreckage that morning, was that the criminal exposure Bonnie Kestrel was actually facing had almost nothing to do with a simple private property destruction charge, and everything to do with a detail buried in paperwork from 1968 that my father had kept, along with every other document connected to that strip's original construction. In a fireproof filing cabinet in our farmhouse office for over 50 years. I called my attorney that same afternoon, a careful, thorough woman named Renata Solis, who'd handled agricultural business matters for my operation for nearly a decade. And while she started immediately working on the straightforward civil case, the destroyed aircraft, the destroyed runway surface, the lost income from an entire spraying season I was now facing without any functional aircraft or airstrip just weeks before the season was set to begin. I went digging through that fireproof cabinet myself that same evening, pulling out my father's original 1968 grant paperwork, mostly out of a need to have something concrete in my hands while I tried to process what had happened. What I found in that cabinet, a detail I genuinely never paid close attention to across 22 years of running an operation my father built, and I'd simply inherited the way you inherit a family business, was a recorded federal grant assurance agreement connected to the original construction funding that had helped build that airstrip in 1968 through a Department of Transportation Rural Aviation Infrastructure program. An agreement that included language requiring the airstrip to remain available for aeronautical use for a period of 20 years from construction, with a further clause, one I had to read 3 times before I fully understood what it actually meant, granting the federal government a recorded property interest in the underlying land and infrastructure that would only fully extinguish upon formal release by the appropriate federal agency, a release that, as far as either Renata or I could find in any of my father's records, had never actually been filed. I called Renata back that same night, read her the exact language over the phone, and there was a long pause on her end before she told me, in a voice that had shifted noticeably from the measured, sympathetic tone she'd used earlier that day, that if that grant assurance and reverter interest was still active and unreleased, what had happened that morning wasn't simply a private property destruction case anymore. It was potentially the destruction of property in which the United States federal government held a recorded legal interest, a distinction that was about to bring an entirely different category of consequence down on Bonnie Kestrel and the Aspen Meadow HOA board than either of them had any reason to expect, standing in that wreckage, congratulating themselves on solving their noise complaint problem once and for all. Renata filed a formal inquiry with the Department of Transportation's regional office the very next morning, along with a copy of the original 1968 grant assurance documents. And what came back within a matter of days confirmed exactly what we'd both suspected reading through that paperwork the night before. The federal grant assurance and reverter interest connected to my airstrip's original construction had, in fact, never been formally released, a bureaucratic gap that Renata explained wasn't actually as unusual as it sounded, since many smaller rural aviation infrastructure projects from that era simply never had anyone formally close out the federal interest once the original obligation period ended, leaving a recorded federal property interest quietly sitting on file for decades without anyone, including me, ever having reason to think about it. That recorded interest meant, in plain terms, that the runway surface and hangar structure Bonnie Kestrel had ordered bulldozed weren't simply my private property in the way she'd assumed. They were property in which the federal government held an active, documented legal interest, and destroying them without any federal review or authorization potentially exposed everyone involved in that decision to federal liability well beyond the civil property destruction case Renata had already been building on my behalf. The Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General opened a formal inquiry within about a week of Renata's initial filing, and I want to describe what it was like watching two federal investigators, a soft-spoken but extremely thorough agent named Elias Kavanagh chief among them, walk the wreckage of my property with the same careful, methodical attention Deputy Renner had shown weeks earlier. Except this time cross-referencing everything against decades-old federal grant documentation instead of local property law. Agent Kavanagh interviewed me at length about the original 1968 construction, about the operational history of the Strip across the following decades, and about the specific sequence of events leading up to the demolition, and he interviewed Bonnie Kestrel as well, a conversation I wasn't present for but that Renata later described to me, based on what she'd learned through the discovery process, as one where Bonnie apparently maintained, right up until she was shown a copy of the recorded federal document herself, that she genuinely had no idea any federal interest existed and had believed the entire time she was simply authorizing demolition of an informal, unregulated private airstrip. I actually believe that part of her account was probably true, that she hadn't known about the federal grant assurance specifically, though Renata was quick to point out, and later argued forcefully in both the civil and federal proceedings that followed, that not knowing about a decades-old federal interest didn't remotely excuse Bonnie from the far more basic failure at the heart of the entire situation, which was ordering the destruction of a functioning 22-year-old aviation business's private property without ever once contacting me, verifying ownership or regulatory status through any actual channel, or pursuing any of the legitimate complaint processes that had been available to her the entire time. Federal investigation moved in parallel with the civil case Renata had already been building, and roughly 6 weeks after the demolition, federal prosecutors filed charges against Bonnie Kestrel personally under statutes covering destruction of property in which the United States holds an interest, along with a related charge connected to the reckless nature of the demolition, given that it had been carried out without any title search, survey verification, or regulatory inquiry whatsoever. A level of carelessness that Agent Kavanagh's report characterized, according to Renata, as difficult to reconcile with any good faith belief that proper authority existed. I want to be honest that watching those federal charges get filed felt like a strange kind of vindication I hadn't fully expected when I first found that grant paperwork in my father's fireproof cabinet, less because I wanted to see Bonnie Kestrel personally face serious consequences, and more because it finally confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, that what had happened to my operation wasn't some ambiguous private disagreement about noise and property lines, but a genuinely reckless act that had destroyed federally protected agricultural aviation infrastructure serving a rural community that, whatever Bonnie Kestrel personally thought of it, still relied on the crop dusting services my operation provided across several thousand surrounding acres of working farmland. While the federal case moved through its own separate process, Renata pursued the civil side aggressively, seeking full damages for the destroyed aircraft, the destroyed runway and hangar infrastructure, and the substantial lost income connected to an entire spraying season I'd been forced to sit out entirely, unable to secure a replacement aircraft or rebuild a functional airstrip anywhere close to the 3-week window I'd originally had before the season began. That civil case went in front of a judge named Desmond Kilbride roughly 4 months after the demolition, and Renata laid out the full financial picture methodically: the aircraft's documented replacement value, the runway and hangar reconstruction costs based on competitive contractor bids, and an entire season of lost agricultural spraying income calculated against my own historical revenue records going back over a decade. Bonnie Kestrel's attorney tried to argue that the Aspen Meadow HOA board had acted in good faith based on a reasonable belief that the airstrip constituted an unpermitted nuisance structure, an argument that Judge Kilbride, according to Renata's account of the hearing, seemed to find considerably less persuasive once she pointed out that a genuinely good faith belief would have, at minimum, involved contacting the property owner or conducting some basic verification before authorizing heavy machinery to destroy a functioning 22-year-old business, rather than simply assuming the worst and proceeding straight to demolition. Judge Kilbride ruled in my favor on the full civil claim, awarding damages covering the aircraft's replacement value, the complete runway and hangar reconstruction costs, and a full season of documented lost income, a combined judgment that came to just over $600,000, explicitly finding that the Aspen Meadow HOA board had acted with reckless disregard for basic property rights verification before authorizing what she described in her written ruling as an extraordinary and entirely unjustified act of destruction. Bonnie Kestrel's federal case concluded about 2 months after the civil judgment, resolved through a plea agreement that Agent Kavanagh's office presented as reflecting both the seriousness of destroying federally interested property and the absence of any prior criminal history on her part, resulting in a period of probation, a substantial federal fine, and a formal restitution order requiring her to personally contribute toward the civil judgment already entered against her and the HOA, rather than allowing the entire financial burden to fall solely on the community's shared reserves. Aspen Meadows' remaining board members, faced with a judgment large enough to threaten the community's entire operating budget for years if paid out in full through HOA funds alone, voted to remove Bonnie Kestrel from her position within days of the federal plea agreement becoming public, and I later learned, through Deputy Renner, that a separate recall petition among residents had already been circulating even before the board's own vote. Driven largely by homeowners who'd had no idea their community's board president had exposed the entire HOA to federal criminal liability over a private property dispute she could have resolved through any number of far less catastrophic channels. I rebuilt my runway and hangar over the following 4 months, using funds from the civil judgment, working with a contractor who specialized in agricultural aviation infrastructure and who took considerable care, at my specific request, to properly document and formally close out the original 1968 federal grant obligation once and for all, ensuring no future dispute could ever again hinge on a decades-old piece of paperwork nobody had thought to revisit. I replaced my aircraft with a newer model and flew my first full spraying season back into operation almost exactly 1 year after the morning I'd watched bulldozers tear through a runway my father built over 5 decades earlier. I think about that morning sometimes, standing on that same rebuilt runway now, watching my own plane lift off clean and steady the way it has for over 2 decades of my life, and considerably longer than that if you count my father's years running the same operation before me. Bonnie Kestrel spent 2 years convinced that a bulldozer and enough confidence in her own authority could simply erase an agricultural aviation business she found inconvenient, without ever once considering that some pieces of paper, filed away and half forgotten for over 50 years, still carry weight heavy enough to reach across 5 decades and land squarely on the person who never bothered to check what she was actually standing on before she gave the order to tear it apart. Thumbnail text: SHE bulldozed federal land and didn't even know it.